Right, after that rather challenging billing, I'm going to talk for the next few minutes a whistle-stop tour on climate change. And I've called this the Ostrich or the Phoenix, hopefully metaphors you're all familiar with. The Ostrich is what we've done on climate change for a quarter of a century, put our heads in the sand and pretended nothing is happening or nothing is going to change, that we don't have to adjust the way we live our lives. Or the Phoenix, which is emerging from, I think, the fossil fuel flames with a new way of thinking of the world. Academically, there's a subtitle to this, which is the sort of exotic term cognitive dissonance, which I often think of as just simply hypocrisy. Or the other version of that is creativity in a changing climate. Actually, can we think very differently about the world in which we live? And I will argue that we have to think fundamentally differently about our world. For those who are interested in modern forms of communication, generally lowish carbon, I have a Twitter account which I only use for work. It's nothing about my sporting activities or what I had for tea, and I always have a website where I can write what I like, and my university can't stop me putting it there. So a lot of what I'm talking about today is actually available in this paper, which was recently published in a Nature journal, and it is available free online. So if anyone's interested in the more detailed side of it, it is all there. But I'm going to start off with what we, many of us here, members of democracies, our governments have signed up to things on climate change. So we effectively all have signed up to something similar to this. This is from the Copenhagen Accord. It could be from Doha or Cancun or any other exotic location that these events ever are. To hold the increase in global temperature below 2 degrees C, notice that below, doesn't say 50-50 chance of, take action to meet that objective consistent with science and on the basis of equity. So we have all signed up to that. But before I go any further, this 2 degrees C framework, which on a cold day in Manchester, where I come from, sounds quite attractive, it's the regional repercussions of that matter. That's about 6 degrees in the poles. We also have to bear in mind, at 2 degrees C warming, which is the best that we can now really hope for, many millions of people will die. They'll be poor, and they will live in the southern hemisphere primarily. There will be low-lying states, they'll be around the deltas, there'll be the 30 million people living on the coastal strip of Bangladesh, or at least some of them. So even at 2 degrees C, we are prepared to sacrifice the lives of many poor, low-emitting people who actually do not really, probably are not common tourists anyway, put it that way. So though we've signed up to that, what's our record so far? Well, the first report from the IPCC came out in 1990, 25 years ago, a quarter of a century ago, probably longer ago than some of you have been on this planet, actually. And nothing has significantly changed since from the science. We knew everything we needed to know then, 25 years ago, to deal with climate change. We just chose to do nothing about it. Since the last set of reports from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we've dumped 200 billion tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That will be changing the climate, as will the lights on in here today and how we got to this event, for the next 100 to 10,000 years, and the science is absolutely clear about that. The emissions of carbon dioxide this year will be 60% higher than when we first pretended to care about climate change in 1990. 60% higher. And the concentration, in other words, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is higher now than it has been for at least 800,000 years, possibly 5 million years. 800,000 years is about 3 times longer than humans have been on the planet. None of us in particular, but as a species. So that's our catalogue of abject failure on climate change. What has changed, and this is a really crucial issue, and it's challenging to every sector, not just tourist sector, but to all sectors, to all of us as individuals, to science community, to policymakers, is that in terms of temperature, what really matters are carbon budgets, our build-up of carbon dioxide day in, day out. Every single day we emit carbon, it remains in the atmosphere for 100 to 10,000 years, changing the climate. It is not about long-term 2050 targets. These have absolutely nothing to do with climate science, and we should never have been using them. It is the build-up of CO2 day in, day out that matters, and that is much more challenging for all of us. My headline conclusion, despite this sort of really gloomy start, is that 2 degrees C is just about viable. We can just about hold to it, but the chances now are very slim. We are in the sort of 2/3 type, 3 degrees C temperature rise realm if we do everything we reasonably can. And as I'll say in a minute, at the moment, we're heading much higher than that. My hypothesis, which again is quite an unattractive one, is that if we are serious about 2 degrees C, we need to dramatically reduce our consumption of energy in the short to medium term, and that's particularly the wealthy parts of the world. But the argument is typically, well, surely we can do that with engineering of one sort or another. And as an engineer that used to work on oil rigs, I think engineering can do a lot, but we cannot perform miracles. Biofuels, wind, solar, nuclear, carbon capture and storage, so forth. These are all low carbon or lowish carbon options. Surely we can solve it with those. But in 2015, it is all about timing. It is the timing that matters. And say we have squandered a quarter of a century in choosing to do nothing on climate change so far. So let's just have a graph here. For those of you that like numbers, it's the carbon dioxide emissions at one side and years out along the bottom. But don't worry too much about the numbers, just look at the shape of the curve. The curve is of carbon emissions, or as I often say, it's a plot of our arrogance or an inverse plot of our concern for the climate. The UN Panel on Climate Change was set up in 1988. The first report was out in 1990. For those with grey hair or no hair, they might remember the first Rio summit in 1992, very optimistic and appropriately so, about what we could achieve. We then had the Kyoto Protocol, that was ratified later on. We had the Copenhagen Accord in 2009, and we had the Rio plus 20. Often people think of as Rio plus 20 years. I think of it as Rio plus 20 billion tons, because that's what we've dumped in the atmosphere during our period of concern. So you see the rise then in carbon dioxide emissions year on year. And despite the recent economic downturn, we've still seen emissions rising at about 2 to 3% per year. Maybe this year could be a little different, but quite high, well, very high rates of increase, about 2 or 3 times higher than the rate of increase we had in the 1990s. As we build power stations, high carbon power stations, gas-fired, coal-fired, as we build infrastructures, sewage networks, roads, train networks, those sorts of things, as we build hotels, buildings like this, as we buy aircraft and ships, we lock the future into doing things with high carbon sort of facilities that we have built. So we are, every single year as we construct these things, locking the future into using high carbon fuels and energy for the next 20, 30, 40, up to 100 years. So this is what we're doing at the moment, and this is what we have to fundamentally change, not in the future, but now. We have to start now. We should have started 25 years ago. We are heading in this direction at the moment, 4 to 6 degrees C. This is a profoundly different world. This is where we're going if we carry on doing what we're doing at the moment. And this supports the view of the International Energy Agency, not a left-wing think tank, normally thought of as being the sort of the voice of the orthodox energy sector, but actually it says some very interesting things now, that the trend of CO2 is perfectly in line with a temperature increase of 6 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, 6 degrees Celsius. And that would have devastating consequences for the planet. That is a different place to live. It is nothing like the world in which we live today. And that's from the IEA. You find similar things from the World Bank or the IMF as well. But what about 2 degrees C? That's the direction of travel that we need to have. A fundamentally different one from the 4 to 6 degrees that we're on. And my contention here is that actually in the short term, there is nothing we can do with energy supply to get us off the higher curve. So we have to do something very different. We have to reduce our energy demand. And that's not just everyone around the planet. There are those of us that consume the lion's share of emissions, and we know who they are. We see them when we put our makeup on or have a shave in the morning. They're staring back at us from the mirror. We know the group that are responsible for most of the emissions. Now, the supply side is really important, but it will take longer to be put in place. So we must proceed with the supply, but we have to do something about demand. And this is a global analysis. You know, when we think about it, actually most parts of the world are not part of this problem. Or at least many of the people in those countries aren't. 300 million people in China consume like we do. 1 billion people in China do not. And that's the same for many parts of the world. There are many, many poorer people there who have very low levels of energy consumption. We have signed up to deal with climate change on the basis of equity. That's what we've signed up to. We should be concerned about the poorer parts of the world, the low-emitting parts of the world that will suffer the consequences of our profligate use of carbon. So if we think about that for 2 degrees C, think about it for us as tourists. What would that mean? You can read about the maths behind this in the paper that I pointed out earlier. But we need to have reductions of about 10% every single year in carbon dioxide emissions. And we should have started a few years ago, really. What does that mean when we think, if we play those numbers out? It's about a 40% reduction in the next few years in our carbon dioxide emissions. And remember, those of us that are higher emissions than the average, which is probably almost everyone in this room, would have to make even larger reductions than that. About a 70% reduction by the mid-2020s, and be virtually carbon-free by the early 2030s for the wealthy parts of the world. And the reason for this is that it allows the poorer parts of the world access to fossil fuels so they can improve their welfare. We know categorically that the welfare of the poor is improved if they have access to energy. In the short term, that would be fossil fuels. We also know categorically that the welfare of the wealthy parts of the world, particularly the wealthy people in the wealthier parts of the world, is not improved by access to fossil fuels, additional energy, not access to it, but additional energy. And we know this categorically from repeated scientific investigations. These reductions are radical. They are fundamentally different. They will require profound changes to how people like us live our lives. But if 2 degrees C is too challenging, and we say we're on 2/3 at the moment, what about 4 degrees C? What are the global impacts of 4 degrees C? This is where we're going at the moment. Just think of the heat waves around the globe and what would happen to those. It's the extremes that really matter when we add a climate signal on top of the existing heat waves. In Europe in 2003, when 20 to 30,000 people died, imagine making that heat wave longer and then adding 8 degrees on top of it. Imagine adding 6 degrees in Beijing or Shanghai, where the buildings have no thermal mass. They will not be able to live in those buildings. In New York and other parts of North America, 10 to 12 degrees warmer. So a 4 degrees C temperature warming has these sort of impacts during these extreme events. This is a fundamentally different way of having to live our lives. At the same time, we'll see large increases of sea level. It's hard to say exactly what they would look like, and we know they're going to continue to go up. Certainly at 3 or 4 degrees C, we're going to melt all of Greenland, but it will take many hundreds of years. But that is 7 meters sea level rise. But by the end of the century, a meter is not unreasonable to think that that's where we're heading, a meter sea level rise and increased severity of typhoons in the southern hemisphere. And at the same time, we're going to see big reductions in the production of staple food crops, maize, sorghum, rice, wheat, those sorts of things, particularly in the lower latitudes, whilst the population is heading towards 9 billion people. You put all of that together, and there's a widespread view that 4 degrees C is incompatible with an organized global community. We will reach for the Kalashnikov and start killing each other, rather than trying to deal with the scarce resources that will be available. It's a very common approach. We always like to blame someone else for the problems that we face. It is beyond adaptation. Many people in the world will not be able to adapt. Often we say, well, we'll be able to adapt. What we mean by that is rich people in the northern hemisphere will be able to deal with these climate impacts. We don't really care that much about the poor who will suffer the consequences of it. And they will not be able to adapt. Many of them will simply die, particularly at 4 degrees C. It is devastating to ecosystems, right? We'll have wiped out the barrier reef and the Amazon and things like that. But also, think of the ecosystem services that are provided for us, the pollination of our crops by bees. These sorts of things will have fundamentally changed as well. And it is unlikely to be stable. Tipping points, non-linearities, discontinuities. The temperature will likely keep going up because we will have triggered natural phenomena like the melting of the permafrost and the releasing of methane. So I think it's fair to say that across the scientific community, and even some of the climate skeptics, would argue that 4 degrees C should be avoided. And I would argue at all costs. We cannot go to that sort of future. We have to avoid going there. And yet that at the moment is exactly where we're heading. So let's return to 2 degrees C. What would that mean for a sector like us, the tourist sector? Well, it's much more than towels, which is what what I come across when I stay in hotels. It's things that are going to be really very problematic. We will have to think, how do we do things fundamentally differently? Deep reductions in flying. Now. Starting now. Massive retrofit of hotels and resorts. Any new hotels and resorts effectively should be passive designs. They should use no external energy. And we should be retrofitting the existing ones to be virtually like that. And given I appear to spend half my life in hotels, they are nothing like that. They have huge energy consumption, my experience at the moment anyway. Slow cruising. You can dramatically reduce the amount of emissions by doing things slowly, whether that's train travel or whether it's ship travel, tricky with aircraft. So we need to be thinking about slow travel for ships, retrofit, and renewable ships, renewable powered ships, that should say. In the short term, whilst we actually put low carbon energy supply in place, we need to encourage indigenous tourism. Not on top of international tourism, but as a replacement for it. And when we do go internationally, we need to travel much slower, take much longer about how we do these things. Again, that will change how we have to live our lives, the sorts of structures we have at work and so forth. No city breaks, or very few city breaks, at least they're facilitated by air. And we must bear in mind, though we like to think there's the poor that are starting to travel a lot, actually, generally it's something like 2 to 3 times the median salary of the people that travel on the planes. It's not the poor that are driving up the use of aircraft. It is generally the wealthy who are traveling by them much more often. We need to lead by example. Now, I can say that for every sector. But today I'm talking about tourism. I often talk about shale gas or the shipping sector. But someone somewhere has to step up and say, we will make those changes. At the moment, everyone's saying, let the others make it and we won't bother. So is the tourism prepared to do that? If not, probably the tourism industry, more than many others, will start to feel the repercussions of our abject failure on climate change. We will decimate the industry that we've come to love and enjoy in the places we love to go and visit. We will decimate them. We will kill the people there. We will destroy the ecosystems. That's the direction that we're heading at the moment. The science is categorically clear on this, despite what we might read in the Daily Mail and the Telegraph. If we are serious about a 2 degrees C framing of climate change, and as I said before, 2 degrees C is not safe if you're poor and in the southern hemisphere. It means deep reductions in energy demand. And we need a Marshall-style plan to build low-carbon energy supply. Once we've got low-carbon energy supply, at least from a carbon perspective, we can carry on living life as we do today. There will be a whole host of sustainability concerns, but from a carbon perspective, it's the low-carbon supply we need. But in the interim, we must reduce demand. And that low-carbon supply needs to be in place by about 2050 with virtually 100% penetration. Ultimately, we have to escape the reductionist mindset of the 20th century, phenomenally successful through the Industrial Revolution. As an engineer, that's what we use, reductionist way of thinking of the world. Universities are premised on this. We split the world into physics, maths, engineering, arts, humanities, economics even. We split the world like that, but the world isn't like that. When we go outside, the world is the mush of all those things together. And yet we have no real framework of knowing how to think about systemic challenges. We have never faced systemic challenges like we are facing now, at many levels, but certainly in relation to climate change. 7 to 9 billion people, a globalized world, huge levels of consumption by the few, but everyone trying to aspire to that sort of model. We don't really know how to resolve those problems. We have a blank sheet of paper, which as an academic is quite an attractive prospect. But we do know that to get out of this, we're going to require leadership, courage, innovative thinking, engaged teams, difficult choices. We're going to get a lot of things wrong because we really do not have really many historical precedents about how to deal with these sorts of challenges. I mean, there are no, the changing from CFCs to HCFCs in terms of the ozone layer or the removal or the solutions we came to with acid rain are not good precedents for dealing with climate change. Carbon isn't everything we do. It's in the paint on here. It's in the clothes that we wear. It's in how we travel here today. We have never had to deal with something that pervasive and remove it from the system in a few decades. We will get things wrong. And let's not pretend it's going to be win-win. There's a lot of green growth myth out there. It's going to hurt, and it's going to hurt particularly those of us that live carbon-profligate lives. And again, I think we know who they are. In the short term, we are going to have to reduce the things that we do, and that will affect the quality of our lives. But that's a depressing way to finish. So I'm going to finish off with a quote from Robert Unger, and I think, I always use this quote. I've never given many royalties for it. But I think it captures the hope, the prospects for the future, and probably in many different challenges that we face. At every level, the greatest obstacle to transforming the world is that we lack the clarity and imagination to see that it could be different. And that's exactly what we require now. We need to imagine what different futures will look like. The future will be radically different from the present, either because we've done something about it and reducing our emissions, or because we'll be hit by climate change. And it will hit us in the wealthy parts of the world, though it will take a decade or two longer. But imagination is not enough. We need clarity. How are we going to put these alternative futures in place? And that is the job of all of us, to think what would those futures need to look like. In this sector, what would a tourism world have to look like if it had to have an 80% reduction in its carbon emissions in the next 2 decades? What would that world look like? And how could we deliver it? And if we think of the world like that, then I think we just about can hold to a 2°C future. So on that, I think, upbeat note, thank you very much for listening.